The question about restorative practices is lots of people think restorative practice is the same as restorative justice. Restorative justice is a wonderful model, a behaviour model that focuses on where there's conflict and tensions and always seeks to repair harm and repair relationships. I think restorative practice gives us a different focus. It's one that proactively puts the building and maintaining the relationships first. It starts to think about the culture and the ethos about creating a sense of belonging, building strong connections across school communities, across our partners and in our communities, but also looks to repair harm and repair relationships when things go wrong. The question I always ask people is, culture exists in every school, in every classroom, but is it by design or is it by default? And for me, restorative practice gives us a really explicit framework to hang our practice on. Lots of schools, lots of teachers, lots of professionals put relationships at the heart of the practice. We just want to move that from being implicit to being a little more explicit. That way we can do it on purpose, we can do it deliberately, and more importantly, we can do it creatively. I think sometimes we don't prioritize relationships enough in the same way, or people see them as something a bit wishy-washy or weak. I think relationships are at the heart, and in terms of building that really strong connection before any content is crucial for us. So a simple phrase is connect before content. And relationships aren't built in a day, they're built daily. And I think the staff who naturally do that stuff, whether it's through a leadership lens or whether it's through a teaching and learning lens or whether it's through pastoral, but what we want to do is just start to create a system that's built and underpinned by relationship-based practice and that restorative framework of doing things with people rather than to them or for them, or even worse, not doing anything at all. As a quadrant, it's originally called the social discipline window. We changed it really to 4 ways of being. It's a very simple quadrant. I'll post it on Twitter later, linking in the hashtag and the ITL look so people can click into it if they want to. But very simply, it's two axes really going from low to high, one going up and one around challenge, and one going across the bottom, one about support. When we say challenge and support, by challenge we mean to set limits, to set boundaries, to have expectations, to really have that accountability. When we say support, we mean words like nurture, encouragement, compassion, empathy, listening, all of those really solid values. If you do high challenge with low support, we often think that's the more punitive, authoritarian. We call that doing two-box. We tend to do a lot of things to students, we don't engage them, and we lead by that more punishment focus. But if we do the opposite side to that of high support, in other words, lots of nurture, encouragement, compassion, but no boundaries, no limits, no expectations, then we often call that the 4-box because we do a lot of things for. Behind that word, we talk about rescuing, making excuses, being permissive. If you do neither of the challenge and support, we call that the not box. Again, we think that's the neglectful practice. Probably happens very little, but let's be really clear, it happens some of the time. The one we're interested in is the one of a balance between high challenge and high support. So there's limits, there's boundaries, there's expectations, but they're matched and mirrored by lots of nurture, compassion, empathy, listening. And we call that the with box. Behind that word, we talk about the word restorative, but it's less important. We're more interested in that notion of doing things with people. Behind that word, again, is the word relational. And the word I always use to pull the whole thing together is that people often confuse restorative practice with being in the with box because we talk less about punitive systems and more about relational systems. But in fact, working in the with box is no less of the authority. It's how we exercise that authority in a way that does things with people rather than to them or for them. I think doing things for people is quick and easy. I also think doing things for people, at least you know it's being done. And dare I say it, at least you know it's being done properly. So even if we're thinking about in a primary, I don't know, a year 1, 2 class, it's really easy to lean over and just turn a page for a child because they're not at the pace you want. They haven't picked a pencil up yet, so you lean in again. So even if we're not talking about systems and practices, even just the basic parts. I mean, I'm a parent of 5 children. It's really easy to do things for my 5 children because at least I know it's being done. Be a leader of an organization, it's easy to do things for people, but what you end up doing then is doubling your workload and people start to expect you to do certain things for them. The worry is then that, people pass their monkeys from their back to your back on a regular basis. And even worse, if you do it for people and it doesn't work, who do they blame? They blame the person who suggested it. So even worse, then you create those ripples back. I think easily, if I can just mention the doing two-box, it's just as easy to tell people what to do. It's quick and easier to do the two-box. Punishments are quick and easy. But I often say that punishment creates resentment, working with people creates reflection. You know, we talk a lot about know our children well and allow them to know us well. If we're thinking about relational-based practice, we talk a lot about 3Ps: personal, private, and professional. We're not asking anyone in relational-based practice to talk about the private, but you have to give a little bit of yourself. In order to know our students well, I'll happily talk about my 5 children. I'll talk about my dog called Dexter and my cat called Alan. Please, colleagues, don't turn off, but I'm an Everton supporter. But I'll happily talk about football. The repair inside the restorative practice is absolutely crucial because, you know, in terms of it, a bridge is the coming together of 2 sides. And we always say whenever there's conflict, there's always more than one perspective. You know, there's my perspective, your perspective, and another perspective, 3 truths. So if we're talking about building real trust, I think there's something in that bit around, you know, how do we manage conflict effectively? You know, I often hear people say, we quickly clarify it, but are people made to sit in a circle, you know, and go through a restorative conversation? Are staff undermined? The reality is, if you create the right culture, staff want to seek out those conversations, and people would do that already. Students, if they've got strong social capital, as Simon described, they've invested heavily in the relationship bank. We might take a couple of deposits out, but if there's enough deposits in the relationship bank, the relationship doesn't break down. And the other bit, I think, around the word trust is to get involved earlier in the life of the problem and earlier in the journey of the child. But, you know, so I think it's thinking much broadly around some of those principles. I always worry if the whole of the senior leadership team are sitting there all lapping it up, ready to go. You know, if you look at any change program, John Cotter, probably the one I rely on the most, you know, the Iceberg's Melton book, for one, if people haven't read that one. The second part, he talks about a change process. Whenever you're creating a guiding team or a team that want to bring about change, whatever that is, you always need a critical friend, somebody who's going to question things. So I also think the phrase, the language we use creates the reality we experience. I'd rather reframe the language from resistance to want to understand a little bit more. You know, so a phrase I talk a lot about is seek to understand rather than seek to blame. The same behaviours we talk about with children, we want to model alongside staff. So if somebody's resistant, I want to understand a little more about what's the unmet need beneath it. I want to work and facilitate dialogue to get to a place where we understand what you need and what I need before we can start to progress this in the school. I also think people don't resist change, they resist being changed. The language we use creates the reality we experience. I mean, do you ever hear phrases like hard to reach or difficult to engage? You know, that puts all of the blame on a family or a child. I'd much rather reframe that. What do I need to do differently to build a relationship with the child? Or I've been unable to build a relationship with a child yet. You know, I worked in schools in terms of, you know, a pastoral role. But, you know, is thinking about, I often got called to classroom where people said, you know, I'm not having them back in my lesson. I used to say, what support or what do you need me to do? Wrong question for me. I've learned very quickly is what needs to be different for them to come back into your classroom. So it's thinking about, I'm not having them back in my class until they're ready to learn. Well, what do we need to do together so they can come back into your class to be ready to learn? Challenging behaviour is another phrase I hear in schools. You know, let's reframe it from challenging behaviour to de-stress behaviour. That moves us from the 2 box, that punitive authoritarian, to one of empathy and relational. The child's distressed, what do we need to do differently? So I think that phrase around reframing language is huge. You know, I love abbreviations for sandwiches, BLT, but I really struggle with calling children lack children in schools. You know, children first. You know, let's leave the labels on jars and not on children. You know, when I do a lot of work on SEND strategies, special educational needs and disabilities, it's quite often a deficit model rather than a strength-based model.